Hello, welcome to AMV Books and Films. My name is April, and today we're going to be going over Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This was just a wonderful African-American novel that I read in high school, actually. I had a brilliant English teacher in 11th grade named Mr. Vanderberg, and he introduced us to American literature, and specifically African-American literature. And I remember just picking up this book and just being totally blown away by just the realism, the rawness of the character, and the vulnerability of the character, the main character, the narrator, and just how gut-wrenching of a novel this was. And the lessons that we learned throughout it are just brilliant. So come with me and we can discuss the various themes of Invisible Man. So immediately what we learn about Invisible Man is that the main character is the narrator of the story. He takes charge of his story, which is something I don't think we've come across so far in the novels we read for Benjamin McAvoy's book club for this year. So the narrator, we never know his name, but he begins his story with the prologue and he ends his story with the epilogue. And so there's these two bookends. So we have the prologue at the very beginning of the novel and the epilogue at the very end of the novel, and these two bookends allow us, the reader, to sort of gather information about our character and what he has learned throughout his journey, which is the main part of the novel, which he introduces. The prologue is very disturbing. If you guys have read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, you notice right away that this is a man who is not in his right frame of mind. He has gone through some difficult things. And he at first describes his home and his recent violent attack on a man on the street who accidentally bumped into him in the middle of the night and had said an inappropriate slur, an inappropriate name, a derogatory name. And then the narrator claims, well, who can blame him? I am invisible. And he kind of reiterates this sort of phrase and this tirade of how he is invisible throughout the prologue of the novel. He just sort of mentions that he is invisible, who can blame him? I'm an invisible man. I remember the first day I became invisible, and by the way, did you know that I'm invisible? So it kind of could be a little bit annoying at first when you're reading the prologue of the novel, but Ralph Ellison does a really good job in describing or sort of painting and portraying the main character narrator as disturbed. There is something not well with him, and you kind of wonder, feels like he's on the brink of an insanity or a mental breakdown, and you kind of wonder, how did this happen to him? And that is the whole purpose of the prologue, is to jar you with this mental dealings of the character, the narrator, and to want to know more about him, why he is the way he is and why he describes himself as an invisible man. Okay, so we're going to begin with the summary of the book. I'm going to hit just some major plot points. There's a lot of major plot points, so I'll probably go over the whole book, but if you haven't read the book, this is probably a good time for you guys to turn off the video, read the book, come back, comment below on what your feelings are towards Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, and then we can hopefully have a discussion in the comments. I love when you guys comment what you guys think about the novel. It's always, entertaining for me, and it also gives me a chance to get to know you guys as well. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started on the first chapter. So the first chapter of the novel, right off the bat, is a gut punch. It hits you. The novel actually begins with the narrator, who we don't know his name, but the narrator begins to talk about his grandfather, and he speaks about his grandfather and his grandfather's ideologies of what it means to be Black in this country and in the South in particular. He advises his family on his deathbed, or right before he's about to die, that in order for them to survive and even thrive in society, that they must be yes men and women, that they should yes them, meaning the whites, to death. So his grandfather felt that his grandson, the narrator, was meek, and in his grandfather's mind, meekness translates to treachery, because he felt that his grandson probably believed everything that the whites had planned for him and for them as a people. And so his grandfather asks his family, and specifically his grandson, the narrator, to yes them to death, meaning the whites. And what that means is that you put on a show of meekness, but when you come home, that's when you retain that bitterness and hatred, and you go about bringing destruction that way. And but the narrator doesn't subscribe to this sort of thinking, this sort of philosophy. At the beginning of the novel, he really felt that, cooperation and coming together and working and never complaining was the right way to go. And so after, the narrator introduces his grandfather and his ideologies, he talks about a time when he graduated high school and he was chosen to give the speech at his high school. And he's an excellent orator. And this caught the attention of local white leadership. And what happened was they asked the narrator to come to a sort of gathering that these leaders, so he had an opportunity to deliver that speech that he had made at his graduation. And so this excited the narrator. He saw this as an opportunity that maybe perhaps he will be considered to receive an education at the local black college that was down in South. So he goes to this gathering, and he notices there's other black classmates from his high school with him. They kind of gather them together and tell them, you're going to be part of the entertainment. You guys will participate in a battle royale. And so they're gathered into an arena, and in the center of it, there is a boxing ring. They're given trunks, they're given boxing gloves, and they're gathered and they're put up into this boxing ring. And what happens after that is they bring out a blonde, naked woman. And this blonde, naked woman sort of just parades around the ring and sashaying, and it's just such a primal scene. You just feel for these young men who have been taught, no doubt, to never look at a white woman or lust after her. And so many of them feel great shame and great guilt, and the narrator reveals what he is feeling at the time, and he feels obvious desire for this woman who is standing naked in the middle of the boxing ring, but he's also feeling shame and guilt. And there is one young man who, he begins to cry in the corner because he's just so afraid of even looking at this woman, and the white audience is telling him to look at her. They're demanding him to look at her. So once they do start fighting, the narrator realizes that he is one of the strong ones, and that he is starting to beat the ones who are surrounding him. Once that is over, and he is one of the 2 or 3 that are last standing, they gather the winners and they take him into another room. By this time, their faces are throbbing. They're in pain. They're scared. They don't know what's happening. And at that moment, the leaders, a group of men, throw money and coins on the floor and onto this rug. But this rug is electrified. And so when the young men, the boxers, try to grab the money, they are shocked, and currents of electricity are running through them, and this just, hurts them and injures them even more. Finally, after that is done, our narrator is able to give the speech. And during the speech, they're not really listening. The white leaders who had asked them to come, they're not really listening to his speech at all, until he makes a mistake in his speech where at one point he talks about social equality. And this causes the white audience, the men, to stop, and they become angry, and they're saying, "What did you just say?" And he realizes that he had made a mistake, that he had said equality, but what he meant was social responsibility. And after he fixes his words, then they can, they're at ease once again. So, and he is awarded a scholarship to the local black college, and he is so grateful for this at this moment, despite all the humiliation and just, horrible treatment that he went through. He is still just so excited. And we can see the stark contrast between his ideologies and his grandfather's ideologies. And the coins that he had gathered from the electrified rug, he opens them up and he realizes that is just fake. It's just fake brass, I believe. They're not real coins. It's not real money. And so what Ralph Ellison is doing, other than showing the blatant racism that's happening in this scene, it's interesting that he utilizes primal urges of people, and men in particular, with this white woman, this naked woman, and for humiliation, and also to put them in their place in the sense that trying to describe them as lustful beings, violent beings, and ones who would do anything for money, just get on the ground on their hands and knees and try to grab the money that they can. It's very sad and it's very jarring when you read this, but excuse me, I have a cold. But it's powerful, very powerful. And what Ellison is trying to say is that these leaders are trying to keep, the Black community in their place by saying that they are, people who live by just primal urges alone, that they can never rise above just basic primal urges. And so it was a very powerful chapter. And then we jump in time to the narrator's junior year in college at the Black college that he got the scholarship for. And we jump in time to that junior year, and he is given the task to drive around one of the college's millionaire founders, Mr. Norton. And Norton becomes fascinated by the former slave quarters that is sort of behind the college there. And he bids the narrator to stop against all the wishes of the narrator. The narrator does comply, and he drives Mr. Norton to the former slave quarters, the farmlands that is behind the school. And it is here that Norton meets Trueblood, and Trueblood was a former slave, and now he is a cropper in that area. The college, we learn, hates Trueblood, and we learn why as Norton and Trueblood have a conversation, and Trueblood tells how he had accidentally impregnated his own daughter in a dreamlike state. Mr. Norton is shocked, and he gives Trueblood money for his kids. And the shock is just so great that once he gets back into the car, he immediately faints. And this, scares the narrator. He has this powerful, the founder of the college, and he's responsible for him, and here he is in the back seat. He doesn't know whether he's dying or not. So what the narrator does, he takes Norton to the Golden Day, which is a brothel / tavern for the Black students there, for the Black community that is down there. It is a place that Mr. Norton has never gone. And at first, our narrator tries to bring some whiskey out to Mr. Norton, but that was against the rules of the bartender there and the veterans. Also, there were some war veterans there who were telling the narrator, no, you need to bring him inside so we can help him. The narrator does, and nothing goes quite to plan. The narrator is looking to get out of there as fast as he can. He knows what type of place the Golden Day is, and it is not something that Mr. Norton is used to. And what happens is while Mr. Norton takes a drink, he comes to, and he is surrounded by all these men and the former war veterans, the Black war veterans, and a fight breaks out, a brawl breaks out, and this just sort of scares Mr. Norton once again, and he loses consciousness once again. So the narrator takes him back upstairs. And then upstairs, there is a war veteran who helps Mr. Norton, and he kind of brings him to and kind of nurses him a little bit. And Mr. Norton is shocked at the knowledge and the skill of this Black war veteran. And Mr. Norton says he's never received that type of treatment, and he's never been cared for ever, and he was genuinely surprised at that. So this physician, he realizes that the narrator is frightened, and he is treating Mr. Norton with such profound respect, almost to the point of reverence. And he mocks the narrator, and he says that, you treat this man as your God, but he really doesn't care about you. Speaking of Mr. Norton to the narrator. And this veteran tells the narrator that you are just a number to him, that he really truly doesn't care about your future. He is helping your college and your fellow students because it makes him feel better and look better. But in actuality, he doesn't truly care about you as a person. And so this jars. Of course, Mr. Norton becomes angry, and he demands to leave immediately. And the narrator, he just complies, and he just kind of goes about his business. He doesn't really think too much about what the war veteran says. It does sort of come about once again later on through the novel. That message sort of rings in his ears a little bit. But there's a lot to unpack here. The narrators and also the colleges and his colleagues' hatred of Trueblood reveals a sort of division from educated Blacks and the poor uneducated Blacks. this hatred, and they're turning their backs on poor blacks is something akin to the treachery that the narrator's grandfather was speaking at the beginning of the novel. We also have the sort of white savior trope in Mr. Norton. The narrator looks at him as sort of a savior, of giving him an opportunity, giving him a chance at education. And so the words of that war veteran sort of ring true here for the narrator. It's interesting to note he still has power over them, while appearing to empower them. When Norton tells the narrator that the narrator is bound to a great dream and monument, Ellison uses the word bound to conjure up images of slavery. So you think of binds, you think of chains and shackles. So Ellison is, very intuitive when he comes with the type of diction and the type of language he uses for his novel here. He is conjuring up that imagery of, there's no slavery nowadays, but there is a sense of enslavement that's going on here between Mr. Norton and the narrator, and probably and also his colleagues as well. Dr. Bledsoe, which is the college's president, when he learns of this, he is extremely angry. He calls the narrator in to his office, and he has him try to explain what's going on. He tells our narrator that he is expelled and that he must go up north to look for a job during the summer, and then perhaps he could come back in the fall to resume his senior year at that college. Dr. Bledsoe, the college president, he reiterates, right before he writes the letters of recommendation and sends the narrator up north, he reiterates the philosophy of Booker T. Washington of humility and the virtue of contentment in one's place. But in Bledsoe, we see that this is all a mask to self-preservate, for self-preservation and advancement, and a way to means of power. He doesn't truly believe, and he doesn't truly really care about anyone else but himself. His compliance and his reverence for the white leaders, and 7 sealed letters of recommendation, and goes to New York. And here our narrator comes to this big new city up north, and he's completely in awe of the change. He sees black protesters on the street and police officers just sort of standing by, and he is sort of flabbergasted at the scene. He is not seeing these police officers going after these black protesters, but in fact that these police officers are there to protect the black protesters, and he's just never seen that before. So he's shocked by that, and it goes on, and he sees people of many different ethnicities as well. He gets to business though right away. He's there, and he's excited almost to get to work. He is excited to get a job, work during the summer so he can return back to the college. And so he goes to the city, and he goes to all the meetings and the addresses given, and he presents his letters, and he's told that he cannot be seen, and this happens 6 times. He's told, maybe we'll call you, and something can happen from there. But 6 of the 7 letters, a couple weeks go by, and he has not heard from any one of them, and except for one, and this is from Mr. Emerson. The man who meets our narrator is actually Mr. Emerson's son, and what the son tells our narrator is that, have you even read these letters of recommendation? And the narrator says, no, I have promised to have them sealed and give them to the employers so that they can read it. And Mr. Emerson's son, who doesn't really, there's no name given for him, for the son, says, well, you need to read this letter. And so he opens the letter, the narrator does, and he reads, and what he finds inside is just also, shocking and demoralizing and sort of disconcerting. And he realizes that Mr. Bledsoe never had intended for the narrator to return back to the college, that he had been expelled permanently, and he was writing these letters so that basically he can just be employed in New York and be kept as far away as possible from the college down south. Our narrator is shocked and angry at this, but he doesn't lose hope, and he still has this resilience, and he takes up a job at the paint factory, which is called Liberty Paints. Even with this setback, the narrator still goes, and he's not quitting. He's perhaps will find a new life in New York and, make it work for him and advance and do well and succeed. And we still have hope for him. But at Liberty Paint, it's a plant job, a factory job. And this job is to make white paint by dropping black droplets and chemical into a milky brown substance. And all around him, there's slogans that say "white is right." And the very name Liberty Paints also is a bit ironic in that the North was seen as sort of a place of liberty and freedom. And what happens is, but the North has its own racial structure as well. And the paint itself is a metaphor. So in order to get the whitest of the white paint, there needs to be a few droplets of black chemical to bring out the whiteness of the paint. And this is obviously a metaphor for white supremacy, in that white supremacy and white order is only achieved through the influence and through the hard work, lending to the notion of a racist sort of capitalist society. The narrator is hurt at the end of this section of the novel, and he wakes up in the hospital. And in the hospital, he awakens to two doctors standing around, and they're sort of speaking to one another, and the narrator is shell-shocked. He's still trying to recover from hitting his head and getting injured on the job. And they're talking of electric shock therapy, and they were talking about lobotomies. And instead of the lobotomy, they choose the electric shock therapy. And this, of course, disorients the narrator, and they ask him questions about his mother, what's his name, and he just can't give an answer. Eventually, the narrator is let go, and he makes his way towards Harlem. And here in Harlem is where things start to get even more interesting. So the narrator meets Mary, a kind Southern black woman who takes him in and feeds him. She tells him a little bit about herself, that she's from the South, but that while she's in New York ain't in her. So she has this sort of, although she is in New York, she is not of New York. She brings those Southern values with her. At this moment, the narrator sees a street vendor outside. He realizes that the street vendor is selling baked yams. And so at this moment, the narrator, he sees a street vendor outside, and he has a strong urge, a nostalgic urge to eat these baked yams that the street vendor is selling outside. And in a beautiful part of the novel, one of my favorite parts of the novel, it's a very deep, dark novel to read. So moments like these were just, bright spots in Ellison's work. So he goes down and he remembers how he used to feel eating that type of food, emblems of his Southern culture. He used to feel embarrassment, and so would his classmates and his colleagues. But now, while he's up north, he feels a sort of sense of freedom and pride in the food that he's eating and the food that he's enjoying. And this is a sort of notion that you see a lot with people of different ethnicities and who come from different cultures. Sometimes the food that we grow up eating carries a sense of shame. And I've spoken to many people of different ethnicities, and them explaining how they were always sometimes embarrassed to go to school because their mom had packed them, a lunch that was food based in their culture. They didn't have the traditional things that other American kids would probably bring to school, and so they always felt a shame and embarrassment because they couldn't eat the same things that the other kids were eating. Many people talk about feeling embarrassed eating these types of foods because perhaps there was derision, in the school systems, or perhaps they felt that they couldn't afford other types of food as well. But at this moment here, we see the narrator not ashamed, but he declares out loud his love for that food, the Southern food that he grew up with. And he sort of shouts, to himself and laughs to himself, to his fellow colleagues back down south, and Mr. Bledsoe as well. Here I am eating baked yams out in the open, and the food that you were always embarrassed to eat, here I am eating it, out in the open, and I love it. I'm not ashamed of it. And just a wonderful, beautiful part of the novel. And I wish there were more parts like that. But there are other spots of of happiness as well. And after he eats, he sees an old couple on the street, and they're being evicted around this time, and the officers are throwing their stuff out onto the street, and this enrages the narrator. He sees the broken stuff and old furniture of this older black couple being thrown out onto the street, and the woman is just wanting just to go back inside to pray in her own home. And this enrages the narrator, and he stands up and he starts yelling and encouraging the crowd that has gathered outside to help them get their stuff back inside. And so the crowd, being incited and feeling that fervor, go back inside, and they help this black couple go back into their homes. Right then the police come, and the crowd is dispersed, and people are running away again. And at the moment, there is a man by the name of Jack who is behind the narrator, and he says to the narrator, that was a masterful bit of persuasion, brother. Jack later contacts the narrator for a job in their organization, the Brotherhood. So it's a group of social activism, but they need an orator. They need a speaker to incite the crowds, to get the crowds motivated for change. The narrator does meet with Jack and realizes that, in order for him to be part of the Brotherhood, he needs to do certain things and follow certain rules. And at this moment, Jack must change his name, change the narrator's name. He must move into one of their apartments and completely break away from his past. So those are the three main things that the narrator must do for this new life and for this job in the Brotherhood, being a speaker for them. And even though the Brotherhood seems to give the identity our narrator has been searching for this whole time, we realize that he is divested of his past and of his former self. We never knew his name to begin with, but now he's given a new name and a new identity. And it's really interesting when he goes to the Brotherhood's headquarters, he sees Jack's mistress, Emma, who's another white woman, and Emma's reaction that he should be blacker. She says to Jack, maybe he should be blacker, indicates that the narrator should be a symbol of his race, sort of denying any individuality. And with a heavy heart, the narrator must also leave his new friend Mary, and that pulls at his heart. The narrator's first job is to give a speech at a rally in Harlem. He is given a pamphlet that he is told to study. Things like buzzwords, slogans, catchphrases, he does, but in the moment he forgets some of these words and some of these slogans, and so he just improvises and speaks from the heart. And after he is done, the Brotherhood sees great potential. Some are very excited about his oration and his skills in speaking, but some members were a bit worried because he failed to speak scientifically, they say in the novel, scientifically, and that means he failed to hit say certain slogans and buzzwords and certain ideological phrases, and so they were worried about that. They resolved to keep him on board, but to send him to another elder member of the Brotherhood, so he can be trained in the doctrine of the Brotherhood, so that when he does make his speeches, he is mentioning all of those words as well. And then the narrator seems proud and content with his new life. And at this time, the narrator meets another brother whose name is Todd Clifton. He's a young, attractive, intelligent man who makes him stand out in the Brotherhood. So Clifton tells the narrator of Raz the Exhorter. So Raz the Exhorter, he's an opponent of the Brotherhood and the Brotherhood's ideology. So Raz the Exhorter is a West Indian, and he shows up often at the Brotherhood's rallies with his clan, his group of people, his followers, in order to disrupt the messages given by the Brotherhood. Raz the Exhorter has his own philosophy, and his own philosophy is sort of a direct mirror of the white racist philosophy that we saw in the South. He believes that there is no peace between blacks and whites, and that in order for the blacks to get ahead and succeed, the whites must eventually be destroyed and disempowered. Todd Clifton, in one of the instances where the narrator goes with Todd Clifton to one of their own rallies, they see Raz the Exhorter there, and Todd Clifton automatically just starts to fight Raz the Exhorter. And Raz the Exhorter is just a big, strong man, very powerful motivator as well, very powerful leader in his own community as well. And some of his ideologies are often, it can be reflected throughout history as well later on with Malcolm X and the Black Panther movement. But here, Raz is about to kill Clifton with a knife, but he stops and he realizes, no, I'm gonna spare my brother. Raz says, because you are black. We have the same skin, and so you shall live. But after he lets Clifton up, Raz the Exhorter goes into a tirade against Clifton and also the narrator, explaining that Clifton should leave the Brotherhood and join him. He tells Clifton that he has abandoned his heritage for white women, and that the white members of the Brotherhood will eventually turn on them. So there's ominous warnings about the narrator's relationship with the Brotherhood, and this is one of them. After this scene, the narrator finds great success in his speeches, and he continues his life with the Brotherhood, and he's doing well for himself. He has an apartment, just a nicer apartment that he would have ever gotten at the men's house or at Mary's place. It's his own space, and it's a lot bigger than anything that he was ever used to. So he's getting comfortable in the Brotherhood and in his role as the Brotherhood's speaker, mouthpiece, okay? And what is happening here, one day, after receiving an anonymous letter warning the narrator to slow down and to remember that he is a black man in a white man's world, he receives a leg iron chain from Brother Tarp, who is another older black member. He tells the narrator to keep it as a reminder of their real cause. Other members believe having this item around dramatizes racial differences. At this moment, a magazine calls, and they ask the narrator if he can be interviewed for their magazine. And in the room is Brother Westrom, and he is another member. Brother Westrom was the one telling the narrator that, yeah, maybe you should go ahead and give this interview. And at the moment, the narrator doesn't want to. He actually suggests Clifton, that the magazine talk to Clifton. But since Clifton at this moment isn't around, he's actually has been missing for quite some time, the narrator just goes ahead and he gives the interview to this magazine. Unfortunately, this ends up blowing up in the face of the narrator. Brother Westrom, the man who was in the same room with him when the magazine called, he tells the leaders of the Brotherhood that the narrator is trying to get ahead of everyone. He's trying to become bigger than the Brotherhood and the cause of the Brotherhood. He's trying to get a bit of fame for himself and become powerful so that there would be no need for the Brotherhood. And the leaders kind of listen to what Brother Westrom has to say and also to what the narrator has to say, and they all agree that there's really no malintent on the narrator's part, but they kind of shift him, and they shift him further south, the downtown area, where he would be working on the women's movement. And while he is down there, he's excited to start something new and to sort of spread his wings in another area of his job and of the ideologies of the Brotherhood. So after one of the rallies of the narrator, as he speaks about the women question, about the women's movement, and a white woman in the audience sees him and invites him back to her place for a little But the narrator realizes that none of it was personal, that it was a sort of fetish, a sort of fantasy that she had. He goes back to Harlem and waits for a call to attend a meeting with the Brotherhood. The call never comes, and he rushes to the headquarters of the Brotherhood. And he realizes that the meeting is already being taken place, that it is happening at the moment. He never was called, and he realizes soon after that the Brotherhood and its leaders never intended for him to go to the meeting. And this is where, he's starting to realize the shadiness of the Brotherhood and of its leaders. He leaves, and once he is out on the streets, he spots Clifton on the street. He had been missing for a while, as we had said. Clifton is seen selling Sambo dolls, and Sambo actually dates back to the slave period and would stand for, basically Sambo stands for docile, lazy, and irresponsible slave. And Clifton is making, he's controlling they're puppets, essentially they're puppets, and he's controlling these puppets, and he's making them sway and dance, and he's singing a song. And this enrages the narrator. He sees this, as a sort of stereotype that is pushing back the progress that the Brotherhood has been making and pushing back the progress of what he feels, the progress of his people. This enrages, he really wants to hurt Clifton and he wants to fight him. Clifton was selling and peddling, supporting the hierarchical structure, a stereotype, and before the narrator could get to him, the police chased Clifton, who was followed by a crowd. After coming around the corner, the narrator sees a crowd gathering around somebody who's lying on the ground, and he realizes that Clifton had been shot. And there was no weapon that Clifton had. The community is shocked, and the narrator delivers a sobering speech to the audience. And you can see that the crowd is angry as hundreds show up for his funeral. And what to make of Clifton is a challenge, as a reader. What to make of him is a challenge as a reader, because indeed he is. On the one hand, he is perpetuating stereotypes that was born during the slave period. However, you also have to pay attention to what he was actually doing with the Sambo dolls, and I hadn't had mentioned this yet, or before. As he's playing and puppeteering these puppets, these dolls, he's saying, he'll kill your depression and dispossession. And so what he's really doing is mocking the Brotherhood and its slogans, because one of the slogans was end dispossession. And he's mocking openly the Brotherhood and the ideologies that the Brotherhood had. So we see Clifton do a total 180 from his role in the Brotherhood to essentially going against them, becoming an antagonist and mocking them in their ideology. But he's also saying that the Brotherhood is puppets. That the Brotherhood is actually puppeteering, Black people for their own cause, and not necessarily championing the cause of the individual Black man or Black person. The Brotherhood disapproves of the narrator's speech in the first place, and even associating the Brotherhood with Todd Clifton because he had left because he was selling Sambo dolls. Clifton is deemed a traitor, and the narrator doesn't see it that way. The narrator claims that the community is angry and that they feel that the Brotherhood themselves are traitors. Jack responds with, "We tell the community what to think." And so we start seeing the cracks in the ideology and also the Brotherhood and their true intentions. They seem on the outside to champion the equal rights of Black people, of women, but when it comes down to it, at the heart of it, leaders such as Jack saying that we tell the community what to think is showing that there is no freedom in this ideology that the Brotherhood espouses. Essentially, they are puppets. They are told what to do. They are no more free than they were when they were slaves in the South. And this is a wake-up call to the narrator. The narrator leaves and on the streets he sees Raz, who is now Raz the Destroyer. Raz denounces the Brotherhood, and the narrator meets with Hambro. Brother Hambro is the brother at the beginning, or towards the middle of the novel, the man who the Brotherhood leaders send the narrator to become indoctrinated with the Brotherhood. But we see here that Brother Hambro also feels the same way as the narrator, that he reiterates what the narrator has been feeling this whole time, and that the Brotherhood is planning to sacrifice him and his influence in Harlem for a wider political goal. And he realizes the error in group identity, that there was no room for him as an individual in this sort of ideology. The narrator finally realizes that perhaps true freedom is unattainable, and that the only thing that the Brotherhood was really worried about when it came to Todd Clifton wasn't necessarily Todd Clifton himself. They were worried about the Sambo dolls and what the Sambo dolls represented. And they didn't really care about Clifton, the individual. And this sort of begins to dawn on the narrator. He starts to realize the fatality of ideology and sort of groupthink. And we see the cracks in the Brotherhood, and we realize that the narrator sees ideology as sort of dangerous. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the narrator wants to destroy the Brotherhood, and he feels that in order to do so, he must gather intel, and he feels that he can gather intel from one of the leaders' wives. And he comes across Sybil, who was a lonely wife in the Brotherhood, and she had always, was attracted to the narrator, and she wants to sleep with him, and he obliges her. He doesn't really want to, but he feels that he can use her in order to gather information so he can destroy the Brotherhood. He realizes very quickly that she cannot provide any information that is, important to him. And he does feel bad about this. He feels bad that he had used her. But at that moment, also, he's distracted by news that there are some riots happening in downtown Harlem, and that the Brotherhood calls him, and they call him to go down and be in the midst of these riots. They want him there. And, the narrator is a little bit confused because, he essentially felt that they had pushed him out and that he was pretty much, useless to them because of his feelings about Todd Clifton's death and his funeral. But he goes anyways. And while he is there, he sees people looting and burning down homes. He sees Raz the Destroyer there, and he's shouting and he's inciting violence and destruction. And the narrator asks some of the people there, why is this happening? What are you guys doing? And they respond with, we're all mad about it. And what they mean is that they are mad about what happened to Todd Clifton. So Raz sees the narrator there. And Raz is ready to destroy the narrator because, according to Raz, the narrator did nothing to harness the energy, harness the anger that the crowd had felt at Todd Clifton's death and at his funeral. And Raz deemed the narrator a traitor, and that he should be put to death, that he should be lynched as a traitor to Black people. The narrator pleads and shouts that by burning and looting their homes and stores, they are falling into the Brotherhood's trap. Raz still wants to attack him, and the narrator runs and hides in a manhole. He escapes, and soon police officers follow. Police officers are there trying to disperse the crowds, trying to stop the riots. And they chase our narrator down into a manhole, and they sort of laugh at him and cover the manhole. And it is pitch black in there, and the narrator can do essentially nothing. But what he does is he lights certain items on fire. He has his briefcase with him, and in that briefcase he had been collecting certain items throughout his time up in Harlem and also down south too. So he starts to burn these items. He burns Clifton's Sambo doll. He burns his high school diploma. He burns the paper of his new name that Jack had given him. He burns the anonymous threatening letter, and he realizes here that the handwriting of the anonymous letter matches the letter or the name, the handwritten name that Jack had given him, and he realizes that it was Jack who had written the threatening letter to him. He burns that as well. He burns all these items because he's in the pitch blackness, and he needs to see in the manhole. He needs to see down there and where it's so dark. He falls asleep, dreaming about everyone, people who were poignant in his life for better or for worse. He decides to stay there, and we are now brought to the present narrator. And after having told his story, he realizes and he tries to go back and he thinks about his grandfather's musings about yesing the white people to death. And the narrator begins to interpret that perhaps his grandfather meant not saying yes to their ideologies and their power and their oppression, but perhaps saying yes to social responsibility, that he must be social responsible and must confront evil and move past it. He realizes that he has lived and felt incredible hatred towards him, and he has felt incredible hatred towards others as well. But on the flip side, he also has felt such poignant love from characters such as Mary, and he also has felt love for others as well. The narrator feels that writing his story down had therapeutic benefits. He feels that bitterness has diminished. He declares that now is the time to end his hibernation and shake off his old skin and emerge. Because although invisible, with an embodied voice, he still has social responsibility. And so the novel sort of ends there. Going back to, identity, the theme of identity. So the narrator, when he is in the manhole and he's burning these sort of items that were in his briefcase, this sort of indicates that he must destroy or burn the ideologies, the stereotypes, the abstract language, the identity given to him by the Brotherhood. All of that has to be burned in order for him to see. And what that means is that he must start anew, to wipe the slate clean, as they say, kind of unencumbered and untethered to what has been told to him, and how he should act and how he should be as a Black person in this country. He must shed all of that in order to find his new identity and his new purpose. The whole notion of him being underground means that he had to sort of die, that these ideologies and these identities had to die. And then when he reemerges, it's sort of like a rebirth, a resurrection of sort, that he is new and that he is ready to fulfill his purpose in this life. And that a single ideology would limit any one individual, and that an ideology can't constitute an entire way of being. He realizes with all the pain and hell he's been through, he can still contribute and help and make society a better place. So going back to also the theme of ideology, which is fascinating, the theme of freedom too, we can talk a little bit about that as well. So freedom, is it ever really a possibility for our narrator? You know, he escapes so many different instances and so many different circumstances to find freedom. And in doing so, he never really truly found it. He did find it eventually in the manhole. Just freedom to choose how to live his life, though. There, of course, will always be racism. There, of course, will always be certain types of negativity, oppression, hatred, all of that. But even with all of that, he can still do what he can with limited freedom. And that's one of the themes that we can see in this novel. And the other theme, of course, is the theme of ideology. And what ideology does, it usually oversimplifies things. So we think back to the hollow buzzwords and the slogans of the Brotherhood, the sort of platitudes and just ideological phrasing that the narrator was compelled to use during his speeches by the Brotherhood. You know, it's hollow, it's oversimplified, and is very unnuanced. Ideology also is a system of ideas that seek to explain the world and change it. It seeks to envelop a group of individuals under an umbrella, and it allows for people not to think. It also allows people to shift their responsibility onto others. So it is comforting. It's easy for them to sort of fall under an umbrella of an ideology, because then they don't have to really think for themselves or be responsible for themselves. And sort of this group think and this group identity takes place of the individual identity. And what's wrong with ideology is that it is not genuine. So ideology brings order to chaos. It tries to articulate and conceptualize what is going on, right versus wrong, bad versus good, who's the enemy, who's the hero. It is very divisive, as we can see. There's no personal introspection when there's when you follow an ideology. When you have an ideology, there's already ready-made answers for you. It doesn't take into account personal experience. It doesn't take into account individual and free thinking. It lacks authenticity. It prevents inquiry and personal development. Ideologies allow for people to remain closed-minded and just sort of engage in dogmatic thinking, where they are unable to step outside of this bubble of ideas, of the set pattern of ideas, and they refuse to look beyond those set of ideas because it's comforting, it's easy, and it's what's for them given them purpose. Unfortunately, you know, the problem with ideology is that it causes suffering for an individual. You know, people must bend and mold their thoughts to fit ideology. It also at the same time fuels ego. So we see that even with our narrator himself, right? He was a mouthpiece for the Brotherhood, and he found solace in that comfort. He found success and importance in that. And so ideologues and ideology can be very dangerous. Leaders are idolized and never questioned. And we can see ideologies all around us. We can see ideologies with political parties, certain racial identities, certain gender identities, and things like that. Patterns of values and patterns of ideas one should subscribe to and never question. In order to combat these things, you should always question biases. You should always question biases, assumptions, beliefs, the beliefs that we hold most sacred sometimes. You have to be open-minded. You have to be okay with not knowing everything, because sometimes we won't always have the answers to the problems we face or the things that we go through. Focus on love and understanding. Don't try to automatically say you like someone or you dislike someone. You hate this person, you love this person. Instead of loving or hating, try describing them. Try understanding them. In this way, you won't be simplistic about other people. You are free from divisions. You learn to love and understand each other. And I think this is what our narrator realizes at the end of the novel, that this is the main crux, at least from my perspective of this novel, that this novel is about freeing yourself from groupthink, freeing yourself from what others say, how you must act, how you must think, what you must do, and to find it in your own self, based on your own experiences. And to become an ideologue, you become hollow. They tell you what to say, they tell you what to think, and that is just disruptive. It's a death, I feel. So thank you for joining me in discussing Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. I highly suggest this novel. I highly recommend this novel. Very brilliantly written, very raw, very real, very vulnerable, very visceral. I enjoyed this novel very much, and it just kind of reminds me, and it ignites the sort of love I had for African American literature growing up in high school. And I thank Mr. Vanderburg for introducing me to Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man. So much to gain, so much to glean from all of this, but I'm grateful that you were able to join me. Please go ahead, like, comment, subscribe if you want to. So the next novel we're going to be reading is Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I'm excited to read the story. I actually have never finished this novel as well. But yeah, so hopefully you guys could join me for the month of August. That is what we're going to be reading. And thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.